both participants and attendees to today's Conversations on South Asia series session hosted by faculty in the South Asian Studies Collective here at Dartmouth College. My name is Kirk Ambetta. I am the faculty coordinator for this year's conversation series, as well as a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows and a lecturer in art history here at Dartmouth. The South Asian Studies Collective is very excited today to be hosting a conversation about Amanda Lanzillo's fantastic new book, Pious Labor, Islam, Artisanship, and Technology in Colonial India, published recently by the University of California Press. Amanda will begin by summarizing the book's content and arguments, after which Douglas Haynes and Rasa Khan will provide their responses to the book. But before proceeding with today's book conversation, I want to make a few announcements and acknowledgements. I first want to make everyone aware of our final event in the conversation series this fall. On November 12th, we will be hosting a conversation about Douglas Ober's book, Dust on the Throne, The Search for Buddhism in Modern India. Do sign up if you already haven't. I think it's going to be a really fantastic discussion. I would also like to thank our sponsors for this event, the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures and Languages, and the Bodhis Fund for South Asian Programming at Dartmouth. Thank you as well to our two Bodhis student fellows, Navya Bharadwaj and Mritula Saravanan, for helping organize today's conversation. Lastly, thank you especially to Hope Rennie and the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures and Languages for all of her help with the series, both in past years and in the present. So one overall reminder to webinar attendees, please leave your comments in the Q&A box and not the chat. And I'll remind everyone of this later as we proceed. So to now proceed with the conversation, I'm delighted to introduce today's author, Amanda Lanzillo. Amanda is an assistant professor in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. She is a historian of labor, technology, and religion. Currently, Amanda is a fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, researching a second book project about Afghan migration and labor in British India and the Indian Ocean world. Amanda holds a PhD in history from Indiana University, where she was previously a lecturer, and she was previously a lecturer at Brunel University and a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University. So thank you again, Amanda, for sharing your work with us today. I'm personally very excited to hear what you have to say about the book.
Should I go ahead and share my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Sorry, I just slideshow. Okay, great. Can you all see that? Perfect. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm very grateful to Dr. Kirk Gambetta for the invitation, and also to Drs. Douglas Haynes and Rasa Khan for agreeing to comment and engage with me on this work, as well as to Navya and everyone at Dartmouth for helping to put this together. I'm going to try to keep my comments pretty short, because selfishly, I'm more interested in Doug and Razak's feedback and in your questions. But I'll start by briefly speaking about my aims for the book and what I see as its contributions, and then I'll conclude by walking us through a short example from one of the chapters that I think illustrates some of the key themes. Pious Labor analyzes North Indian Muslim artisan engagement with technological and material change from the consolidation of the British Raj after 1857 through the global economic depression of the 1930s. The book narrates histories of Muslim technical knowledge and culture making among urban laboring communities, including metalsmiths, stonemasons, tailors, carpenters, and press workers. Artisan laborers in late 19th and early 20th century urban North India faced radical industrial and technological shifts. They incorporated new machines and materials into their work, often laboring in workshops where ownership and authority were ceded to members of the middle class or to the colonial state. To negotiate these changes, Muslim artisans adapted long-standing Muslim traditions about the revelation of their trades by God, the cultivation of trades by the prophets, and the sustenance of pious knowledge of their trades through both Sufi and trade-based lineages of Muslims. Many Muslim laboring artisans began to circulate these claims through the increasingly accessible print economy of late 19th century North India. In doing so, they've reasserted and reimagined traditions and practices that I term artisan Islam. I use artisan Islam to refer to a broad range of narratives about laboring Islamic pasts, claims on piety of work or of a technology, and the development and intersection of Muslim social, religious, and laboring spaces among artisans. The varied artisan Islams that circulated among workers often also incorporated reference to the caste and social hierarchies experienced by laborers, and even sometimes contributed to the consolidation of class solidarities. So I want to take some time at the start to talk about how I've written and approached these histories, and specifically questions about the archival material that I've used. I characterize the core archive of Muslim artisan engagement with industrial change as comprised of technical manuals and community histories written primarily in Urdu. There was not always a sharp distinction between these two categories of text. The interplay between description of technical practice and community and religious community history is suggestive of how artisans negotiated colonial economic and material change. My ability to tell the stories of Muslim artisan communities in colonial North India is thus predicated on overlooked books and texts produced by and for artisan workers. I've sought to read technical manuals not only as instructive lists on how to perform work or use machines, but also for their religious and cultural perspectives. These perspectives included the gendering of trades, often as masculine, a process that was informed by colonial policy and elite Muslim gender anxieties. They likewise include references to experiences of caste status and marginalization, a theme that is too often minimized in South Asian Muslim histories. Reading artisan archives also requires abandoning an underlying assumption of much of the scholarship on Indian artisans, namely that because many artisans were illiterate, their communities did not read, produce, or engage with text. I'm not suggesting that most artisans and laborers in colonial North India could, in fact, read well, but forms of community literacy, orality, and engagement with the text as object all contributed to a widespread circulation of technical manuals and community histories. Indeed, the authors of some community histories and technical manuals explicitly noted that their texts were not only intended for literate people. One, attributed to a tailor and master of sewing named Khwaja Muhammad and printed in Allahabad in 1909, even concluded with a note that the treatise was meant to provide blessings for, quote, anyone who reads this treatise or hears it read aloud by another. In other cases, and particularly in versified manuals and histories, authors encouraged readers to memorize their books to facilitate their oral circulation. Ultimately, I argue not for the dominance of textual knowledge, but rather that artisans nested textual knowledge within other ways of knowing their trades. I analyze the multiple uses and limitations of artisan texts, often positioning them within a workshop, factory, or site of training. Pious Labor makes two major historiographical interventions. It reads laborers and their technical knowledge into the story of colonial-era South Asian Islam, a field that is often dominated by studies either of theological movements or of elite self-fashioning. Conversely, it places Muslim artisans and their knowledge within histories of South Asian labor and technology, where they have often remained marginal figures. I upend persistent narratives that portray laboring Muslims as religiously marginal compared to their elite and middle-class counterparts, and therefore discount their experiences of Islam. I place laboring non-ashraf or non-genteel Muslims at the center of claims on Islamic knowledge production and circulation. I join a growing number of scholars in critiquing histories of South Asian Muslim communities in the colonial era that sideline class, caste, and labor as categories of analysis. Simultaneously, I argue that Islam was vital to how Muslim artisans understood their social positions as laborers and contested their marginalization within North Indian class and caste hierarchies. Here, I build especially on work that has emphasized religious and caste-based self-assertion within artisans' laboring identities across religions. I show, moreover, that Muslim artisans often argued that the very thing that placed them in quote unquote lowly positions in class or caste hierarchies, physical labor carried out with their hands, actually made them masters of technology in a way that middle class Indians could not hope to achieve. Because they sometimes understood those technologies and skills as Islamic, their command over them implied a Muslim practice that elevated artisans as distinctly pious. The book is organized by trade in recognition of the significant differences in these processes across different fields of work. It examines the religious and laboring lives of scribes and press workers, metalsmiths, tailors, carpenters, boilermakers, and stonemasons. The decision to focus on these trades was in part a practical one, a reflection of the artisan manuals and trade histories available to me. At the same time, it was based on my desire to suggest new directions in the study of South Asian artisanship by decentering some of the questions that have traditionally been asked, often through studies of weavers and textiles. By focusing on trades such as carpentry, stonemasonry, and metalsmithing, I was able to examine overlooked stories of urbanization, movement between related trades, and resistance to new colonial hierarchies of technical knowledge and oversight through religious idioms. Rather than taking us through all of the chapters, which I think would take a while, I want to briefly walk us through one specific story from the book, from chapter 5, which I think is illustrative of some of my broader arguments. I'll focus on communities of blacksmiths and other artisans who transitioned into railway labor, particularly as boilermakers engaged in the repair and maintenance of steam engines. In technical manuals, the term karigar, which I often translate as artisan, referred to both the skills associated with craft workers and the status of a wage earner, challenging colonial assumptions about the sharp divide between traditional craft and industrial work. Karigar was an especially important identifier for urban artisan communities in which many workers were in the process of shifting to new industrialized trades. Boilermaking was one such field. Hakimuddin, the author of a boilermaking manual titled the Khalid Sanat, or the Key to Industry, was a master artisan who asserted a Karigar identity for himself and his fellow locomotive workshop workers. Hakimuddin was the son of Daswandi, a blacksmith from a small town near Amritsar, and he framed his text as aimed at others from Karigar backgrounds who hoped to transition to boilermaking. He wrote the Khalid Sanat while employed as a head fitter, which was a well-paid position responsible for the maintenance and repair of steam engines in the Northwest State Railway's locomotive department at one of the largest workshops in Sindh. Educated both at home and in a colonial industrial school, Hakimuddin was part of a small cadre of upwardly mobile hereditary artisans who found a supervisory position in state employment through the colonial railways. In a lengthy introduction, Hakimuddin lays out his hopes for the future of Indian karigars, though he begins by acknowledging the divine true mechanic, phrasing that is evocative of other artisan references to God as creator within their trade. In artisan manuals, we encounter not only God, the true mechanic, but also God, the eternal tailor, the supreme ustad, and the eternal calligrapher. Infinite praise is due to the true mechanic, who, with only divine power, unrestrained by tools or measurements, created the perfect human engine, making it the origin of 1,000 tomorrows. For Hakimuddin, the steam engine allowed humanity to, quote, draw forward the train of endless progress begun through divine creation. He portrayed craft and industrial knowledge as a train that moved continuously forward from the time of creation, gathering speed and power. But he lamented that most textual knowledge on railway labor and steam engine repair was not accessible to Indian artisans who might seek to transition to these new trades. He criticized colonial and technical institutions for relying primarily on direct translations of European works. Most translators, he lamented, do not consider that they must bring a book new life. They reject the idea of taking parts out and putting new parts into the book. He critiqued elite translations of technical manuals for writing in a style of Urdu that was inaccessible to karigars, decrying specifically their preference for neologisms developed from Arabic over widely used English loanwords for technical terms. Instead, Hakimuddin wrote, We have compiled the book for this community, in which there is no need for ostentation or pretentiousness. I should note, however, that he did choose to write in Urdu rather than Punjabi or Sindhi, and I can talk about some of the dynamics of why in the question and answer. So how did Hakamuddin seek to communicate knowledge of the steam engine in a way that reflected workers' embodied or material knowledge? His description of the steam injector used to provide cold water to the boiler from exhaust steam is a good indication. Let us think of the injector as if it were a hookah, in which the base will always keep its form. Blowing into the hose of the hookah will produce a fountain of water in the base and steam out the other hose, which will disperse, so long as there are no obstacles in the mouth of the hose. But if a stone is placed on the mouth, then steam will only be able to come out if the force of our breath overcomes the weight of the stone. In the same way, water from the injector flows into the boiler. There are many obstacles in the way, so now we must provide the formula that overcomes the obstacles and clears the way for water to enter the boiler. This description of the hookah as injector is moderately useful. To be honest, as someone who's never worked on a steam engine, it doesn't fully explain the mechanical properties of the steam injector. But I don't think that was Hakamuddin's goal. Instead, he wanted to make steam technology seem accessible to artisans who possessed related embodied technical skills and knowledge, but limited experience with boilers. His treatise assumed embodied knowledge, both of hookahs and the principles of metalworking, that an artisan boilermaker could draw on as he navigated the technologies of the railway locomotive workshop. I understand Hakamuddin's text as part of the broader efforts of Muslim master artisans to valorize knowledge practices, both material and religious, that were often excluded from understandings of technical authority. He valorized the ittifaq, concord or consensus, that he hoped to build among artisan workers as a form of social solidarity. But his successors in the railway workshop looked to other forms of class solidarity and connection. Beginning in 1907, a group of Muslim railway blacksmiths and boilermakers in Punjab organized an Anjuman-e Musle Qome Ahangaran, or Organization for the Uplift of the Community of Blacksmiths. The group, led by two Lahore-based smiths named Firozuddin and Ziauddin, printed an accompanying periodical for several years. Colonial reports suggest that it both explained new technologies and argued for social status, class solidarity, and improved wages for railway smiths. And indeed, well into the 20th century, Muslim artisans continued to celebrate the divine nature of their distinctive forms of knowledge and to argue that they set them apart from their capitalist and elite supervisors. To that end, I'll conclude with the verses with which I open my book. They're extracted from some verses written by a blacksmith in Rampur in North India after independence, suggesting that Muslim artisans' embodied knowledge of their work and faith persisted despite the violence and displacement of partition. Authored by a blacksmith named Nazir, the verses highlighted the power of divinely revealed Muslim artisanal knowledge, which forced a capitalist or sarmayadar, the possessor of wealth, to bow his head before the smith's God-given prowess. And I'll read both in Urdu and in English, but I apologize that I have a very American accent in every language. So, Dihe wo qudrat khudai pak ne hadad ko, kar diya hai mum jisne fitrat fulad ko. Tere dinai pasar, तूने ये रत्बा बढ़ाए थी के जौहरदार का आज लोहा मानते हैं सब तेरे तवार का तेरे दनाए पसारे कारहोनों का मदार तेरे आगे सर झुकाए रहते हैं सरमायादार. The pure Lord gave such power to the blacksmith to turn to wax what was iron by nature. You have raised the status of the jeweled blade. Now all acknowledge the metal of your sword. All workshops depend on your wisdom. The capitalist keeps his head bowed before you. These verses likely circulated through a mix of oral and textual communication in the physical space of the workshop, so dependent, as Nazir says, on artisans' divinely revealed wisdom. And so I want to end by noting that in the contemporary context, as Muslim workshops and homes in North India increasingly face the threat of bulldozers, the exultation, all workshops depend on your wisdom, might serve as an important reminder of the centrality of Islam to Indian social history. Um, Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Amanda. That was fantastic. Do you mind just yeah, that's
Yeah,
perfect.
and sorry, I hope I didn't go too far over time.
No, not at all. That was perfect. And it was really nice to actually, I think, introduce to our audience some concrete examples from the book. I really appreciate that. Um, so now I'd actually like to turn to our two responses. And so to make sure that we stay on time, I asked that questions be addressed after both respondents have finished speaking. So before they share their thoughts, I'd first like to introduce both Douglas Haynes and Rosa Khan. Douglas Haynes is Professor Emeritus of South Asian History at Dartmouth College, where he taught in the history department for 41 years. He's written extensively on the social, economic, and cultural history of Western India. His books include Rhetoric and Ritual in Colonial India, published in 1991, Small Town Capitalism in Western India, published in 2012, and which I think is the most relevant to today's discussion in many respects. And most recently, he published The Emergence of Brand Name Capitalism in Late Colonial India. His edited books and articles cover such topic areas as cities and urban politics, artisans and merchants, capitalism, consumption and advertising, masculinity, conjugality, and sexual science. He is currently working on a book about the origins of the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad and the first generation of students who graduated from the institute between 1966 and 1980. After studying at the University of Delhi, our second respondent, Raza Khan, received his Doctor of Philosophy in 2014 from the Graduate School of Muslim Cultures and Societies at the Free University in Berlin, where he is now also a research fellow in global history at the Department of History there. Subsequently, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the History of Emotions at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin and at the University of Erlangen Center for Islam and Law in Europe. He has been affiliated with the Center for Modern Indian Studies at the University of Göttingen, where he is finishing his habilitation project titled Minor Cosmopolitanism, Islam, Urdu, and Emotional Integration in the Life and Writings of Syed Abid Hussain, 1896 to 1978. Among his publications, he has edited special issues for the Journal of the Economic and Social History of the Orient in 2015, and another for the Journal of Comparative Studies in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East in 2020. His book, Minority Paths, Locality, Emotions, and Belonging in Rampur, was published with Oxford University Press in 2022. Most recently, he co-edited Nodes of Translation, Rethinking Intellectual History Between Modern India and Germany, published by De Gruyter Oldenburg at the beginning of 2024. Congratulations on that book. So thank you both for generously responding to Amanda's book today. Doug, I'd like to invite you to start us off.
Okay, well, I want to thank Kurt and Amanda for asking me to contribute to this occasion as a commentator. Amanda and I have been in touch for perhaps 2 years now about a collective project that she and others have been organizing on artisans, including a session at the European South Asia Studies Group and a collective issue of a journal. And I've been engaged with this project more from the standpoint of the collective contributions of participants rather than the perspective of Amanda's own individual contributions. So this occasion really allows me to consider her contributions very separately. I thought my comments might be most distinctive from other feedback Amanda has been getting and from other comments she'll get today if I came at it from the angle that I'm most familiar with, and that's the historiography of the artisan in India. It's not the framework that Amanda chooses explicitly in the book, but one that the book actually says a great deal about. And in the process, I'll be working almost backwards to Amanda's most central concerns in the book, which I think break out of the conceptual boxes that the historiography has created. But basically, this book makes a number of major contributions to the history of artisans. I think it's rare that a book that makes so many contributions on so many fronts as this does. Now, the historiography of the artisan has most centrally been focused on the place of the artisan in the larger economy of colonial India. It's mostly been focused on material concerns. And as Amanda pointed out, the figure of the handloom weaver is often seen as representing the larger state of the artisan economy. Handloom weavers are not addressed directly in her book, but I think the book does have strong implications about these actors, which I may refer to. At the same time, Amanda makes clear there's a much wider range of occupations involved in the artisan economy, something that to a certain extent has been ignored in the literature, at least until recently. Now, in simplistic terms, the historiography originally suggested that South Asia had had a very rich artisanal economy in the pre-colonial period, but this gave way under the pressure of competition with European manufacturers in the context of industrialization. Um, that narrative figures very little in Amanda's narrative because she highlights the wide range of artisanal occupations that continued to operate, perhaps even thrive in the context of colonialism. At least this is the appearance, so that many of these occupations are really thriving in this context. Artisan activity, I think it becomes clear from all this, from this study, was central to the economy of colonial India. Now, beginning in the 1960s, there was a new literature that emerged that highlighted the large number of artisans who continued to practice their professions through the entire colonial period, despite the pressures of European competition. So millions of artisans continue to function in colonial India during this period. And again, this perspective was focused on handloom weavers. This revisionist view expressed very little concern with artisans beyond the handloom weaver, and it pictured artisans largely as static actors who had managed to survive, but were not major agents of economic and cultural change themselves. So the artisan didn't really appear as agents of history. Um, this kind of perspective changed mainly with the work of Tirthankar Roy in the 1990s, who inaugurated what might be called the revisionist perspective. And he highlighted not only the huge number of artisan figures and the broad range of activities they were engaged in, but stressed their involvement in bringing about change. And so I would say we've now been in, and I would place my own work in that context, in this phase of the revisionist perspective. I've done some things different than Tirthankar Roy, but I would still place myself in that. But one of the important things that's emerging in this revisionist perspective is the important role artisans played in technological change. And actually, I recently wrote an article for the Cambridge Economic History, which is coming out, that tried to bring out the range of small scale new technologies, everyday technologies, if you will, developed by artisans. But Amanda's book, I think, really goes beyond anything that has been written in highlighting the role of artisans in the technology of artisan production and the role of artisans in developing new technologies. I really wish I had had access to it when I was writing. Maybe I still can get Amanda's work into that article. Technological change was ubiquitous. was really proliferated. And so this really breaks with, in this respect, seeing technological change merely as something that stems from large-scale factories and from large-scale capitalist enterprises. And we can see now that very small-scale actors adopting imported techniques or even inventing their own were at the forefront of very significant changes. Um, so that's my first point, and the rest will be shorter. So the book makes important social history contributions. The literature on the artisan, even in the revisionist perspective, early revisionist perspective, tended to neglect what I would call social history concerns. But these are highlighted in Amanda's book, which regularly explores the relationship between artisans and other social classes, as some of Amanda's um, comments pointed out. People like patrons, merchants, members of the middle classes, and so on, and also points to the formation of new solidarities. Um, so it's hard to summarize these findings here because they are very varied in character. There's no simple narrative that is unifying everything in this book. Now, in the process, and this might be more of a surprise to Amanda that I make this point, but I think the book offers new understandings of India's middle classes. The typical account of the middle classes stresses its insulation from process of technological change. The colonial administration accused the middle class of being unconcerned with developments outside the literate professions, refusing to take up practical concerns, reluctant to address technical issues. But while Amanda's book is focused on artisans, the middle class constantly appears as a set of actors relevant for this history. Artisans are described as producing texts for the interests of the middle classes. The middle class is seen as acting as intermediaries between artisans and wider society. And also the middle class is sometimes seen as displacing artisans as it acquired technological knowledge in engineering schools. So, to my mind, this book suggests that artisans and the middle class can't be placed in separate boxes, insulated from one another, as I think that the historiography of both the artisans and the middle class have done. If you're looking at a book on the middle class, you're rarely going to encounter an artisan. If you're looking at a book on the artisan, you're rarely going to encounter members of the middle class. So perhaps this points to a reevaluation of the middle class more akin to our understandings of where engineering, the field of engineering and information technology have become so central to the middle class occupations today. Perhaps the most central concern of the book, of course, is its concern with Islam and the way that artisan actors gave shape to concepts of Islamic piety through their labor and through their discourses about work and technology. My sense is that in the literature on Islam, this book is innovative because it posits the existence of distinctive artisanal forms of Islam based upon artisan experience. But it's equally transformative in the literature on the history of artisans, which really had ignored the mental universe of artisan actors before this. All the literature I've mentioned up to this point ignored this universe because really no one had sources to reconstruct that universe. Among historians, perhaps only the exception was the work of Nitha Kumar, who wrote on leisure practices of Hindu artisans. An anthropological work that established the way that Muslim weavers established the sacredness of their craft was Deepak Mehta's book, Work, Ritual, Biography, and Ritual and Biography. And there's also Kiran Narayan and Kenneth George's work on the ways that Hindu artisans and workers evoke ideas concerned with the deity Vishwakarma in a work that Amanda draws upon at a number of times. And I think that's a very interesting, those references are very interesting. But this is the first major work by an historian that seriously interrogates the religious conceptions of artisans in the past. And it demonstrates a multiplicity of religious ideas associated with Muslim artisans. So, as Amanda pointed out, more it's more correct to talk about artisan Islams rather than a single artisan Islam. And this brings me to the fifth and perhaps to me the most interesting contribution of this book to the history of artisans. And and I say this as a historian, and that is its reliance on a fantastic set of historical texts. Um, the historiography of artisans, for the most part, has relied mostly on documents produced by the colonial state and the emerging nationalist movement, with only a smattering of materials coming from those actually involved in artisanal production. If you had asked me whether it would be possible to construct a history that gets us so much closer to the outlooks of actual producers and other artisans engaged in crafts activity, I would have said this is only marginally possible, largely because, as Amanda pointed out, the majority of artisans were illiterate. I think the suspicion was that artisan productive technological and cultural practices were transmitted largely through oral means and would never be manifest in print. But Amanda has done this as a remarkable job of research that's taken her out of the colonial archive and found this large number of technical manuals and community histories that she's painstakingly discovered. So this is makes possible her to address new questions that were not ever present in the historiography of artisans, and to break out of a path that is not simply revisionist of previous work, but that goes on in totally new directions. And so, very, very rich and interesting book.
Thank you, Doug. I'd now like to invite Lala Khan to give his response.
Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, thank you, Kurt, and for this invitation. And I'm grateful to Amanda for thinking of me to be in conversation with this important book. I'll call it an important book. I'll also call it a hard book to write. And I want to acknowledge Amanda's extreme hard labor that you can see in writing of this book. Let me begin by sort of giving Amanda a backhanded compliment. And I spoke to her about this. When I started my research on Rampur, I was interested in small town, and labor was a concern of mine, but I was too picky about having an archive before I'll immerse myself. And this is a book that requires you to move and shift gears as you write this book. And you can see she went on this journey that I think has yielded immense product. And for that, she deserves a lot of acknowledgement and for not being path breaker, but I think also creating a path for more scholarship to emerge. So I want to begin by acknowledging the value of this book in creating possible new histories. So, with that labor reference, I want to think of this book in line with three other issues that are in the title of the book. So, I think the book make contribution to three large terrains of history writing in modern South Asia. This is history of religion, Muslim identity, history of labor, and history of science and technology. Now, these three are very well developed historiographical field, and one would hesitate to even engage with one, given the enormous literature and pressure to be authentic and new. And Amanda has not only found a way to be original and new, she's also very good at synthesizing these otherwise field that needs to be more in conversation. So that's the other larger I think, success of the book, that it puts these three fields into conversation. Um, what I also found important about the book is that instead of sticking to a region, it moves around in different terrain. So methodologically, that is important because I think that was the challenge. We try to look for a location or we try to look for an archive, and then we are hesitant if it is too desperate or too spread out. But on that, Amanda, I'd like to hear more. And I would like to hear the journey through which you didn't choose something else and why you chose these. This is not the argument about why it is not in the book, but it is an invitation to think through. And I want you to turn to Bengal and Kerala, because I think those are have been two very historically productive sites. And I wonder if you want to take us at least into your decision or your thoughts on thinking about earlier work on peasant Islam in Bengal in particular. And I particularly want to bring Rafiuddin Ahmed's work, and there have been more work because of to think of the idea of different ways of conceptualizing Islam, as you put it, artisanal Islam or artisan Islam in conversation with peasant Islam. With Kerala, I think we have another opportunity, which is to think of Islam in conversation with environment. Monsoon Islam, we have a book. We can also think of Gulf and migrant Islam and forms of other kind of labor in which Islam is part of this wider global history. And I think you're kind of doing that in your new book. So I think that would be a very productive direction, and I think uh, would be interesting for you to sort of bring that into conversation. So, Amanda, the problem with your book is it contributes in so many directions that it's hard to sort of summarize. I have 12 points, but I don't think I can bring them all in. But let me try. Um, I want to make a point about archival strength of this book as not just about hard work and different texts that you managed to collect. I think it's an important intervention in the way I see South Asian historiography going in, particularly about Muslims, where there has been a textualization of Islam, but from religious studies perspective. And that's a that is a particular take because it's coming from religious studies. But I think you're bringing historian to those texts in a historical archive mode, which I welcome because I think there's a tendency in which the archival has, if not disappeared, has become slightly undermined. And I think not only you bring new texts, you also invite the Urdu literary study scholar to revisit this archive of the marginal, which is also seen as not very interesting because it's not creative and poetic. But I think your mode of reading them and not just finding them is very important, and how historians need to work with material that may seem repetitive, but in that repetition is a point. So I found that very methodologically innovative approach. I also think, and we have Professor Doug Haynes here, so I can't help but share my excitement about the return or the centrality of the small town in the new work. And Amanda does not only do small town, she does something much more interesting. So she's looking at bigger cities, she's looking at smaller town, but she's also looking at circuits and connection and disconnect. That's, I think, a advancement on that approach. I want to push you on a particular point, and by pushing, I mean I want you to think with the two arguments you make in your conceptualization. I want you to think and speak further about the category of pious Islam, no, pious labor and artisan Islam, and as to why and how you think they work, but also go in different direction, because I think there's something productive there. I also want us to think with those two concepts about the idea of laboring Islam or Islamic labor. And I say this because the point where I think your book can also engage with is this idea where some form of labor is seen in the terrain of theological. And there is a theology of labor that I think you're talking about. But I also want to sort of bring this into conversation with studies on ulama and madrasa student, because there is anthropological evidence to suggest that a lot of madrasa students come from that background. I'm here thinking of course, anthropology, not history, and I wonder if there are more modes of history conversation. I might get sort of driven by the very different argument, and I'm sorry if I'm moving in different terrain, but I also think there's a way in which, if not explicitly, you are making us think of the category of the subaltern and the category of the Muslim in interesting ways, which I do want to point and bring back one of my favorite historian, Gyan Pandey, on this. And I want us to think with, but also bring you in that conversation about the figure of the bigoted Julaha, not only as something that has been overworked, which probably it has been, but to think about the category of the over Islamic or bigoted artisanal subject in conversation with a new kind of relationship with Islam that you are mapping, which is not through the lens of the colonial, but through the agency of the artisanal. So I wonder what are ways in which we can think of Islam as not just a governing colonial logic, but also this other archive. And that's where I think the point that Professor Dr. Haynes was making, that this is also a book about middle class ashraf and elite Muslim discourse on ways of being Muslim. So it has the potentiality, I think, to bring back that debate, not just as a debate about deindustrialization, on which also you make intervention, but I wonder what are ways in which we can think with artisan about this larger question about how Muslim thought with Islam in colonial archive, but also through their own Urdu archive. I think I probably have crossed my time, so I don't want to go on and on about this, but that's partly because of the various direction in which you take us with in this book. And I thank you for opening, I think, really a space for more conversation. And I think this is the beginning, and perhaps there will be more such conversation. And I'll stop my points with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Razak. Those were really generative thoughts for us to talk about now. And also, if you did have other thoughts that you want to share throughout the conversation, we actually have a little under half an hour to talk, so we have a bit of time to flesh things out. So maybe before we turn to questions in the Q&A, maybe Amanda, you'd like to share some initial thoughts and responses to what Doug and Razak have said. And I would also just like to remind everyone to please leave any questions you have or any comments in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you for those really generative and thoughtful comments. And I appreciate. I guess I'll start with Doug's comments. And I appreciate this sort of laying out of I guess where the historiography of artisanship has developed and what the different directions have been, because I think I've sometimes felt a little bit uncertain about my place within it. And it was lovely to hear you summarize both how I fit in and what I've done differently. I think that part of that uncertainty has come out of the nature of my archive. Right. So I sometimes, and this also I think goes to part of Razak's question about how I came to the project and how I navigated the archive. But particularly early on, I sometimes felt that the archive that I was looking at wasn't answering the questions that it was supposed to be answering. Right, that there are these questions that have been asked about artisans, and there are certain debates about the nature of artisanship in colonial India. And the materials that I was looking at seemed to me to be a history of artisanship, but one that I sometimes struggled to directly connect to those questions. And so I appreciate you sort of setting out both how I fit in and how I've sort of deviated, I guess, led by this distinctive archive. And I'm excited especially to hear about this work that you have forthcoming on sort of small scale new technologies and everyday technologies. Because I think that, one of the things that you laid out here is the innovativeness of artisan engagement with new technologies and with these everyday technologies. And I think that that's something that I'm glad to hear is going to be perhaps unpacked in an article like this, because again, it was something that I struggled against a little bit, right? The materials that I was looking at were clearly portraying artisans as people who were making things anew, and who were, if not creating a technology from scratch, then certainly putting a completely different spin on its use and its meaning in the colonial context. And so I'm eager to read that new work, and to be in conversation with it. And then the point that you made about new understandings of India's middle classes. I'm really glad to hear that you took that from the book. I think it's something that I also struggled with. I guess balancing the intervention that I was making around artisan experiences and artisan social worlds. And then this sometimes like looming presence of the middle class, and the fact that I couldn't entirely always separate artisan actions and middle class actions, and that these communities were in fact in conversation with each other, and not sort of existing in separate boxes. And I think sometimes I felt that I did have to sort of turn to middle class forms of writing, sort of textual production about industry and about artisanship in order to fully understand the context that artisans were writing in, what they may have been writing against, or what they may have been writing with. And so I think studying these spheres that maybe we assume to be separate together has been very productive for me. But I'm glad to hear that you agree, because it was also something that I really struggled with in writing the book. Yeah, and thank you again for all of your comments. And it's really nice to also sort of get this type of feedback, even though the book is done. As Doug knows, I have several ongoing related projects. And so it's nice to have some of this sort of laid out in front of me. And I think sometimes other people can more accurately capture what you're doing than you can. So thank you. Razak, thank you for these summaries and provocations and questions and encouragements to, I think more broadly, geographically more broadly, and think about certain categories that maybe underskirt parts of the book, but didn't necessarily come to the fore in it. And particularly this question of why did I end up focusing on the localities that I focused on, and what localities might be productive to think with comparatively. I think partially I was driven, and you mentioned, like we often look for sort of I guess a cohesive single archive. And I think I was driven in part by the publishers of the text that I was looking at. And eventually, so originally, yes, I was going to look at like 3 separate cities. And then I realized that I couldn't do that because I kept finding these texts that were produced in Lahore or Lucknow, or Allahabad, or sort of all across North India and parts of Punjab, across this whole span of Punjab and UP. And I couldn't say that a text that was produced in Lahore, then it would show up in Allahabad, or it would show up in some part of Eastern UP, or it would show up even in these small public libraries that I was traveling between. And so that, I guess, became my location. It was like the spaces that I could trace these books to, and also trace where they had come from and where they were produced. And that's why I think the first chapter is about print labor and is about sort of Muslim artisans in the context of lithographic presses. And this question of, what might Bengal or Kerala, or especially work on peasant Islam and Islam in the environment say to my interventions. I think honestly, that's a question that I'm going to sit with, because I think that what you got to towards the end of your comments, this understanding of laboring Islam versus Islamic labor, the categories of pious labor and artisan Islam, and the ways that they're kind of in tension with each other, I think that can certainly be expanded out to think about the spaces of Muslim piety and practice, not only beyond the ashraf, but sort of in conversation with what work looks like for a variety of people, and what the difference even between labor and work is. And so I think that particularly thinking about sort of peasant Islam and the ways that that has been conceptualized is actually very much in line with my work on artisan Islam or on Muslim pious labor. And particularly, I've started looking at texts not only in Urdu, but also in some other regional languages, Punjabi and Pashto mostly, that are very much in this vein of pious labor, but look at pious labor, I think, beyond the workshop or the karhana, and also describe the piety of agricultural work. And so I think that there is actually a bigger, much broader sphere that obviously extends in broader geographies, but also across broader forms of work, to perhaps even include intellectual work, as you suggested. And that maybe is better left to a more rigorous theorist than I am. But I hope that my work will at least contribute to that conversation.
Thank you, Amanda. We actually have a few questions, and I think what I'll do is I'll read them, and if you don't mind, I'll put them together, and then you can respond. And I would also invite our other participants here today to chime in if you also something about these questions kind of instigates something for you. So the first question from an anonymous attendee is thank you for the presentation. They have two questions. You described how the Karigar retains status as both a craftsperson and a wage worker. Can we understand this form of labor as transitional in the history of capitalism? Is that too simplistic, they ask. And their second question that they ask is, how was class and caste solidarity among these 20th century artisans linked with the later Pasmanda movement, if at all? So those were actually two questions bundled together. Then Sarah Melsons asks and says, thank you for a fascinating, important book and for it being published in open access. Yes, absolutely. We are grateful to UC Press for publishing this open access and making it accessible to a wide audience. I second that. She asked, to what degrees are these manuals illustrated? And I believe you showed one example, she says. And could you comment on whether the iconography differs in any way from British colonial manuals and treatises? Did iconography play a role in reaching out to illiterate artisans? She asks. The last question is from Dr. Sajjad Ahmed Dar. So he asked, or they ask, how did this divine knowledge of the artisans and its production that this book has dealt with help in the construction of nationalistic economic thought, which ran in parallel to the colonialism? I mean, does this work concern itself with it? That was the final question. I know that's a lot, but it's some good questions to think with.
Yeah, these are great questions to think with, and thank you all for asking them, and I'll do my best to answer them. So, sorry, I know I rambled on a little bit in response to Doug and Razak, and so I'll try not to ramble as much here. But in terms of the question of labor as transition, this type of labor as transitional in the history of capitalism, I think there are aspects of it that are transitional, right? The movement between craftsperson and wage worker. But one of the things that I tried to pull out in the book is that people could be both, right? So not only do you have people working within the colonial railways who are still thinking of themselves as craft workers and framing their work as like rooted in a craft lineage. But you also have people who work in a colonial industrial factory for a little while, or in a privately owned industrial factory for a little while, and then move back into sort of their familial Klarhana setting, who are working seasonally in different places. Or sometimes if they're facing an economic downturn, they'll take up work as a wage laborer, but then try to transition back to their trade. And so I think one of the things that I was trying to argue in the book is that these the Muslim narratives and sort of the Muslim imagination of craft and work, they're moving quite flexibly between these spaces because these people are also moving flexibly between these spaces. And I think I maybe need to go back to the anthropological literature on this, but I think that this is not necessarily a particularly innovative insight on my part. I think that in anthropology, we also see these types of flexible movements of craft workers and wage laborers. And in terms of the class caste solidarity and the Pasmunda movement, so I did sort of look for things that were perhaps evocative of the sort of later 20th century and contemporary Pasmunda movement. The term is not used yet in the material that I'm looking at. And there is this broader literature, I think, in the study of South Asian Islam and sort of non-elite South Asian Muslim communities about the question of Ashrafization and whether sort of caste marginalized communities are aspiring to become Ashraf, sort of this narrative of, last year I was a Julaha and this year I am a Sheikh, and God willing, if the economy goes well next year, I'll be a Sayyid. And so is this sort of just, are these narratives that they're laying out just sort of aspirational Ashrafness? And I tried to argue in that some of that is certainly an undercurrent, but it's not the primary undercurrent. And that in fact there are well-established sort of lineages and sense of community that people are asserting make them distinctly pious and make them good Muslims outside of their relationship with sort of so-called higher caste or caste dominating communities. Yeah, and so I think that perhaps if somebody were to do a longer history tracing these movements into the second half of the 20th century and into the contemporary period, you could find not necessarily direct connections, but certainly parallels with contemporary Pasmunda movement efforts. In terms of the illustration of the manuals, yeah, so one of the interesting things that I was trying to think about in writing the book was, why are some manuals illustrated and others not? I think in a lot of cases it was a question of cost. A lot of the manuals that I looked at actually are not illustrated, and they tend to be cheaper. Or these are particularly like community histories where the author is saying like it's really important that everyone in the community have access to this book, and they're sold very cheaply. They're often very short and on sort of like not very high quality paper. And so in those cases, it wouldn't really make sense, right, to include an illustration because then you have to pay an illustrator or sort of pay for this other form of production within lithography. The images that I most often find in artisan technical manuals are very close to the images that are in sort of colonial technical manuals themselves, right? Sometimes they are copied directly, so like literally just like copy paper was used in this lithographic production. And so like an image was taken from a colonial textbook and just like set right down in an artisan technical manual, which I think is really interesting because it shows us that artisans are aware of this other space of writing about technology, that they're engaging with this other space of writing about technology, and they're often rejecting it, right? They're saying, wait, it's not good enough. I'm going to take the image because the image works, but I need to explain this more clearly. I need to use clearer language. I need to explain our relationship with this type of work. But then they say, the image is clear, so I'll just sort of take the image wholesale. So that was something that I really enjoyed in terms of like looking at these texts and then reading them against and in conversation with sort of colonial iconography. Um, in terms of nationalist economic thought, um, I think what is interesting is the ways in which maybe these texts are echoing, or in some cases, even preceding elements of nationalist economic thought without framing themselves that way. So in the Khalidi Sanat that I looked at, one of the things that I addressed briefly in the book is that the author is kind of using these sort of Swadeshi arguments, but he's a railway boilermaker, right? He's working within the colonial state, but he's saying like, oh, Indian karigars, you need to learn this so we can take it over and so that the Europeans don't have control of this aspect of the economy anymore. And he is displeased with middle-class supervisors who are coming out of some of the engineering schools who he sees as too closely aligned with Europeans, and he's also displeased with the fact that Europeans are there and that they are controlling this technology. And he's sort of arguing that railway boiler making itself should almost become like a Swadeshi technology. He doesn't use the word Swadeshi, but I think there are these certain parallels in the way that people are framing their Indianness, framing the origins of certain forms of knowledge and who should have control of certain forms of knowledge and who should be able to use those forms of knowledge to create an Indian national economy. And so that's the way that I read these texts in conversation with nationalist economic thought. I don't often see like direct references to that space of knowledge production, but I think it was certainly an undercurrent that people were aware of and in conversation with. Um, should I let you read the other questions here?
Yes, but I think Razak had a question as well.
Yeah,
So maybe do
it,
you want
it
to say that before I read the other question?
yeah, it's a question I wrote, but I wanted and I anticipated the Pasmanda question would come, and I think, Mada, that's an important space. It's of course coming from the present politics, but I see something else that your work might bring to that debate, and I would love to hear you speak a little bit more on that. So when we are talking about labor and caste among Muslim, it's not that as same fit as the debate around caste among Hindu, because something else enter, which is through the category, and I like to hear more on this. When we are talking about labor, are we also here talking about skill and technologies interface with labor? And I'm bringing this point to go beyond this argument that this is just a caste or a class question. It sort of intersect through the technological aspect too. So it's not working people, wage workers. These are people making claims of them knowing skills. And I'd like to bring you to some of your other work. So you've worked on butchers, and in the book you also talk about stonemason. And I've been asking Amanda about graveyard labor. And in that you could see that. So there are people who work with the dead body, and the people who work on the labor of aestheticization of the graveyard. And within that same space, you'll see different kind of intersection of caste, labor, and skill. So I wonder if there's an opportunity here through this conversation on caste among Muslim to bring this other element that you're bringing, which is that not all artisanal class would fit into this easy thing. And I think that that's a productive tension to create. But I don't want to put you on spot on that, but I love to hear your thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll keep it short and just say that absolutely. I think that um, as I think both you and Doug pointed out, there isn't necessarily a universalizing narrative of what artisanship is in this book. And in fact, there are really significant differences in terms of the class and caste standing of different artisan communities that I look at in the book. And some of them are sort of oriented to their command over technology. Some of them are oriented towards like remaking community and reasserting what might be understood as a form of caste status. And others are oriented towards the development of class identity and the assertion of class identity. And all of these things are often happening across a single community. But I think that like the chapter where I look at electroplating, for instance, that's very much about, I guess, a not necessarily very cohesive group of metalsmiths, all of whom are turning towards the technology of electroplating as a way of asserting a form of social status in colonial India that is perhaps separate from questions of class and caste, or at least a little bit different than the questions that we've traditionally asked of class and caste.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm sorry about the noise in the background. It's not too loud. Um, Maybe I'll just quickly read these two questions. So from Safwan Amir, who congratulates on the book, they say, I was wondering if there's a larger connection to guild histories from early on, say in the medieval period. How would you say artisanal labor, especially the pious part, differs from it? Is it primarily about the colonial intervention, or is it more? Is it possible that there might have been other kinds of continuity, say similar to the kinds of ijaza that is transmitted from the sheikh to the student? I remember the Kisbatnama, for instance, that is transmitted across barbers, that gives an example. The next question is from Megha Chand Inglis, um, who thanks you for this amazing work. They say, I'm curious to understand if your artisanal protagonists were working across or with different religious communities. And if so, what kind of material practice did that entail? And what did that do to notions of self-representation in text or illustrations?
Thank you for both of these questions. And again, I'll try to answer them succinctly. In terms of connection to earlier guild histories and what is changing in the colonial period, I think in the book, my argument was really print is what's changing things in the colonial period. You certainly do have for almost all of the trades that I looked at, kasabnamas that circulate in manuscript form. And I'm familiar with your work on barbers as well. And so I think that is quite a sort of common way of writing about a trade or transmitting knowledge about it. The kasabnamas could be transmitted in manuscript form orally, and then you get to the mid-19th century, at least in sort of the space of Urdu that I was looking at, and they're increasingly being printed. And I think print here is sort of the crucial change, because it allows these texts to speak not only to the communities that they're intended for, but to serve the small. So if I'm looking at the Idrisnama, which is the book aimed at tailors in the third chapter, and which traces its sort of functions as, in fact, it says it is translated from a Persian kasabnama that was in manuscript form. But what it seems to be doing is speaking to tailors, but also aware of the fact that because it's printed and there are hundreds of copies now circulating, that it can sort of stand up to colonial forms of knowledge about who a tailor should be or who a tailor is, right? So I think artisans are aware of the fact that print allows their text to circulate in different ways, and to extend beyond what might have traditionally been an Ustad Murid type relationship, and also to, I guess, assert a protection for an Ustad Murid relationship, and sometimes the texts say very explicitly, this text cannot be used without an Ustad. And so it's sort of operating, I guess, in both directions. In terms of the question of the relationship with other religious communities, and this is something that I didn't really address very much in the book because it would have become a different book. And I think one of the things that I tried to argue was that the artisans that I was looking at, they are sometimes communities that have been understood as having syncretic practices. And the same goes for Hindus and Sikhs who practice similar trades. And in this period, they were very conscious of presenting themselves as piously, distinctively Muslim. And that speaks to contemporary reformist movements that are concerned with sort of purifying their practices, and also the artisans' own awareness of the fact that they're being accused sometimes of being syncretic. But because of that, because the texts are so concerned with presenting themselves as not syncretic, it becomes difficult then to build out and to see sort of relationships and practices across faith traditions. And so I think that you correctly point out that this has to do with notions of self-representation, right? And I had to make a certain, I think, decision at a certain point in writing the book that what I was interested in was self-representation, and in this moment, self-representation as a Muslim artisan, what was usually important for the communities that I was looking at. And that is not to say that there weren't shared spaces of practice, both in terms of the practice of a trade and in terms of the practice of a faith. But I guess, yeah, in terms of self-representation, that was not the story that these artisans were interested in telling. And I decided that for the purposes of this book, I wanted to stick to that story mostly.
Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we reached the end of the session. I'm sure we could continue, and I wanted to thank everyone who attended the session today for being with us. Do join us again on November 12th for the session about Douglas Ober's new book. And thanks again to Amanda, Douglas Haynes, and Raza Khan for being with us today. We really appreciate your time and generosity.
And thank you, Kurt, for organizing and keeping things running smoothly.
Of course. So